I just want to go over briefly. I started covering Mike Madigan in 1981. I was an intern with the Alton Telegraph, which had an internship in the State House Bureau in Springfield. And so that was the first year that Mike Madigan was a legislative leader. He was actually a minority leader, Madigan. A lot of people think, oh, he was only minority leader for 2 years, but he was actually minority leader for 2 years before he became speaker. And so I worked there, and then I worked with the Peoria Journal-Star. Lauren Wassell, who's right back there, helped me get that job. He still regrets it, I'm sure. Lauren was going to be the longest distance receiver here award today, but my high school prom date, Lynette Wiley, showed up, and she's in from the Virgin Islands, not just for this talk, but anyway, thank you very much all for coming. And I went on from the Peoria Journal-Star to the Sun-Times, which John alluded to. I worked with Fran Spielman there and covered City Hall, covered the end of George Dunn and beginning and one term of Dick Phelan at Cook County too. I covered Rich Daly, the second Mayor Daly, while I was at the Sun-Times. I went down to Springfield and worked for the Associated Press, and that happened when my wife became the executive editor of Illinois Issues magazine. Some of you may be aware of that magazine too. Then when a job popped open at the Tribune Bureau in Springfield, I walked down the hall there in the State House Bureau and took that job, covered that place in Springfield for 17 years for the Tribune, came up here for 10 years, working mostly in depth in investigations, etc. So now for what you came for. I'm going to read you a little bit here, and then I'm going to have some fun and just talk it out to you and tell you some tales. Over 50 years as a lawmaker, Mike Madigan built Springfield into his own personal fiefdom. Madigan lorded over the House for 36 years, making him the longest-serving speaker in American history. He leveraged the legislature to enhance his control over politics and leveraged his politics to enhance his control over the legislature. He largely protected Chicago City Hall and his big campaign donors in labor, the legal community, and of course, the clients of his former legislative staffers and fellow lawmakers who became lobbyists and cashed in on access to the man on the throne. Madigan became known as the Velvet Hammer. As far back as the 1980s, he developed a reputation for persistence but subtle force, some would say not so subtle, as he beat down his opponents. He also was known as the Sphinx because he often sat quietly in major legislative negotiations and held back his thoughts. And eventually, I viewed this all as kind of the Madigan mystique, which he helped flourish because he didn't really give much of a hint to what was going on inside that mind of his. And one of the things was, and I pointed out, one of the first things I said in the book is, what does the speaker think? Because that was the question everybody was asking all the time. And decades before Donald Trump was out there pushing for everybody to do redistricting, Madigan was way ahead of the game. When he first came into Springfield, there were 24 congressional seats in Illinois. Then there were 12 Republicans and 12 Democrats, evenly divided. When he left, there were 18 congressional seats, and there were 13 Democrats and 5 Republicans. So doing the redistricting is a major, major thing. Dell is not part of my presentation. So how he got into control in the first place is a quick story in itself. Illinois has this deal where if you can't get an agreement on how to draw the lines, it goes to a bipartisan panel. They try to work it out, and if they can't get it worked out, they literally draw a name out of a hat or a bowl. This is the only place in America that does that to try to get the tiebreaker. And so in 1981, when he was the minority leader, they couldn't get an agreement. They pulled a Democratic name out of the House, and he got to draw the lines for the House, and he was able to parlay that into 36 out of 38 years as the Speaker. And he didn't give it up until he was under pressure and eventually ousted. But he said at the beginning of one year that there was a redistricting year. He looked out into the House while he was giving a talk, and he said, if you haven't done this redistricting thing before, buckle up. And that's what I advise you to do here on the rest of this talk, too. His toughest critics called him ruthless, an iron-fisted power-monger whose sole purpose in life was to win, to keep the gavel, to hang on to that power. Yet, the Southwest Side lawmakers' friends and even some foes called him a political and legislative genius. Eventually, prosecutors alleged Madigan crossed the line when he squeezed what amounted to ghost jobs and contracts for allies from ComEd and AT&T, two major utilities, of course, that won lucrative legislative victories. ComEd would pay a $200 million fine, a record in Chicago, and AT&T would pay $23 million. They would cooperate in exchange for bribery counts against them to be dropped. He eventually did not get convicted in the AT&T angle on that, but we'll get to that. ComEd allegedly put Madigan's choice of people, Madigan's choice, on the board of directors of this utility that is regulated by the state. They gave him numerous internships for college students based in his legislative district, and that housed the 13th Ward, which is where he was committeeman since 1969, from 1969 to 2021, where he reigned there as Democratic committeeman. The people that he also got ComEd money were the subcontractors, two former aldermen, two top precinct committeemen, and a former assistant majority leader of the Illinois House. In addition, prosecutors accused him of scheming to line up property tax appeal business for his private law firm by trying to orchestrate the sale of a parcel of state-owned land to a developer looking to build a hotel in Chinatown, as well as trying to trade tips on real estate business with a guy named Danny Solis, who was a former 25th Ward alderman who ended up wearing a wire so that he could get out of his own offenses. He wore a wire on Ed Burke too, and eventually that was one of the biggest takedowns in Chicago history, where these two Democratic titans who launched their in the 1960s under the original Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley, the patronage king who perfected Chicago's Democratic machine. Now, let's get into the fun of it. The legend, I talked to you about the luck of the draw, but I'm going to talk to you about a couple other things here. They happened in 1988 and 1989. I happened to be down there covering it. And 1988 was a story that may ring with some kind of deja vu today. The White Sox were looking to move to a different stadium. They were in the old Comiskey Park, a feeble but well-beloved place on the south side of Chicago, in Mayor Daley's old stomping grounds in Bridgeport. And so it looked like they were going to move to Florida. And it looked like that there was no chance that the Illinois legislature could get it together to give them their own package. I I know that sounds familiar, right? They can't get it together again with the Bears Stadium deal. So they also can't get it together with the White Sox, talking about a different stadium too. And so I want to call it this, and I've called this the White Sox miracle. It was June 30th, 1988, and it looked like they weren't going to get it passed in Springfield. Nobody really thought it was going to pass in Springfield. Legislation that would give some kind of financial incentives to eventually build what is the park where the White Sox play now, which is, I think, a great park, even though they're talking about leaving it. And by the way, Murakami is back in the game after being out a few weeks, so we're all happy about that. But so they came to this point where it didn't look like anything was going to move, and Governor James Thompson, who was a Republican, started going up to the Senate and talking to some of the Republican lawmakers there, and they said, you know, this is personal. We can't be a town without two baseball teams. And sooner or later, boom, they started lining up with it. They had people popping out of their seats during a roll call. Adeline Geocaris, who was close to 80, if not in her 80s, popped up out of her seat and said, I like St. Petersburg, but I like the White Sox too, and the White Sox ought to be in Chicago, not St. Petersburg. And so Tim Degnan, who was a senator for Bridgeport area, says, you know, he's sponsoring the bill. He says, it's the bottom of the ninth, we got to pass this, and the bases are loaded. We need 30 votes, and if they don't get 30 votes before midnight, the vote tally that would be required would be 36. So nobody thought they could get 36, so the time was ticking away. Well, it took a long time to get those votes lined up in the Senate, and although a few minutes in legislative time can be like days or years for the rest of us. And so they finally got it passed at 20 minutes till midnight, and it still had to go to the House. So Thompson roars out of the Senate chamber, and he goes with a phalanx of aides. They open up the big wooden doors, and he rolls through the rotunda, and it was like Moses parting the sea there. And legislators in the House were standing up, they were already yelling, they were already debating it by the time he got there. And it didn't look like the votes were in the House either. And so Madigan runs into his office. It's all dark because one of his little daughters is sleeping back on the couch there, and he's looking for this list of persuadable lawmakers, right? And he's fumbling around, he finally finds them, then he races out through the hall and into the chamber, and Steve Brown later recalled, Steve Brown was his spokesman, he later recalled, that was the only time in 37 years that I've been with him that I've ever seen Mike Madigan run. So he's out there, he's running on the Democratic side, Thompson's worked the Republican side, Thompson goes over to the Democratic side, and this is such a big event at the time that it is going live on WMAQ radio and around other places too. I think also in Florida there were broadcasters all lining up across the top of the balcony there in Springfield, rolling tape on this. It was going live, and it was pandemonium. People were up yelling. I ran up to the floor and see what was going on, and it was just an amazing scene, and there were people wanting the vote to be tallied. They started voting, and they were way short, and then the votes started creeping up. They were still way short, and people started doing one of those countdown clock type things, 5, 4, 3, 2, like there was on New Year's Eve in Times Square. Other people were singing, na 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 na, hey, and singing it much better than I just did. But anyway, they were telling everybody that they should end the debate and count the votes and get it over with and move on. And people from downstate were like, man, we can't even fund the schools properly. Why are we dealing with this right now? And so suddenly the majority leader working for Madigan, Jim McPike, who is a Naval Academy graduate, steely guy who flew airplanes in the wars, suddenly takes over the gavel. And he takes it away from a downstater who was in the chair, and she was opposed to the bill. And then he says, "Okay, clerk, take the record." And the record is taken. They're 6 votes short. Well, he hasn't dropped the gavel yet. So he suddenly looks like a quarterback, with like 5 seconds on the clock, fading back, and he looks out to one lawmaker named Terry Park on the Republican side from Hoffman Estates, and he says, "Representative Park, you want to change your vote?" "Yes, I do. I want to change it to aye." Looks over to the Democratic side. Lou Lang from Skokie jumps up and says, "I want to change my vote to aye." So suddenly they're 4 votes short. There's 2 guys from Peoria. One's a Republican, Fred Turk. One's a Democrat, burly firefighter from Peoria, and they're pointing at each other. They were going to vote no, but if one of them votes yes, the other one better vote yes. So they're pointing at each other. The clock is ticking down. Charlie McBarron, the guy broadcasting, goes, "I don't know what clock they're looking at here, but you know what? They're very close to midnight." And about this time, that big sharp tone that comes up at the top of the hour on the radio that you hear, that goes off, and you can hear it. This broadcast is still out there on the internet if you want to pick it up. It's really something. And Charlie's going, "Well, I don't know what time they're looking at. I'm not sure what the clock is." And I'm up there looking at the tally board where there's a clock, and suddenly the numbers on the board start going into very weird characters, nothing resembling numbers or letters or anything. They're just blinking, blinking, blinking. And it's this kind of surreal moment in the House there, and they're 2 votes short. They pick up another one, and McPike is looking around, and Thompson is standing there in his rolled up sleeves and his suspenders. He's going, over here, and he's standing in front of a guy named James Stang from the suburbs, and Stang gets up and he says, "I vote yes," and McPike, now it's clearly way past midnight. McPike takes the gavel and says, "At 11:59, the bill passes." Bang. So we're like, how did this happen? And reporters had been writing stories that said, hey, didn't look like it was going to go. They had to run downstairs, and they were taking quotes off the squawk boxes from the press room. And so we run out and talk to Madigan. He says, "Well, my watch was 11:59. And Thompson is like levitating by now. He's so joyous because he wanted it so bad. And he comes over to a scrum of reporters, and I'll remember Carol Fowler, who was a great broadcaster from downstate stations, later came up here and worked as a news director, and she was like challenging him. It was after midnight. And he goes, "Was not, was 2, was not, was 2, was not." That went on for a little while, and then he says, the guy in the chair who was holding the gavel said it was 11:59, and Madigan said, "No court in the land is gonna overturn this." And guess what? No court in the land overturned it. So we raced up and grabbed the printouts of the roll calls, and it had the time on it. It said 12:03. And so we're running back down, and then Madigan's staff starts freaking out, and they grab all the roll calls they can get, and they use whiteout on the time, but they forgot to mark out that it was July 1. So it did end up in court, and of course there's still a stadium there that shows that it didn't get very far, but it did end up in court in Florida too, and one judge down there said, there's only 2 times in recorded history that the sun and the clock and the time has stood still. One was in the Judeo-Christian Holy Book. The other was in the record of the Illinois House. So that's my White Sox miracle. But Madigan wasn't done after that. That was 1988. In 1989, he came back after Thompson had been pushing for 3 years to say, I want a tax increase for Illinois. He wanted to raise it from 2.5% to 3.5%, which is basically a 40% increase on the personal side. And so Madigan repeatedly, obstinately, and almost every day said, I do not see any reason why I should be convinced that Illinois should have a tax increase like the plan of Jim Thompson. So, quietly, he worked up his own plan. Nobody knew this was coming except for a couple of great newspaper reporters. One, my mentor, and Lauren's mentor, Bill O'Connell at the Peoria Journal-Star, where I was working, and was down there at the same time. And Charlie Wheeler of the Sun-Times, and Mike Sneed had the story that Madigan was coming out with his own tax increase. It was a temporary tax increase, and it only took it up to around almost to 3%. And it just happened to coincide, of course, with Rich Daley, the new mayor, Rich Daley, the young Richard M. Daley, just got elected and needed some money for schools and for the city. And so, boom, guess what? Our Journal-Star and the Sun-Times hit the newsstand down in Springfield, and the place was, again, like pandemonium. Nobody could believe it. Madigan, who had been opposed to the tax increase forever, suddenly is for it. Thompson couldn't believe it. He comes running in. He's lumbering up the grand staircase. The reporters are swarming him. We're chasing him up the grand staircase, and he finally stops at the top of the third floor outside the House chamber, and we're saying, what's going on? What do you think? What do you think? I'm going to go see if it's true. So he goes back into Mike Madigan's office, and Madigan picks up one of the papers, looks at Thompson and says, "Bonsai!" So, and amazingly, within 6 hours, he put that up to vote and passed it with 60 votes in the House, all Democratic votes. Greatest, probably, political power play I'd ever seen. And so, let's just remember a few years happened between then and now, where he's now in West Virginia in a prison. But some of the things that happened, we had a whole bunch of different governors. We went through Edgar, and we went into the 90s, and in 1994 he actually lost the speakership because of the contract with America year that Newt Gingrich won the U.S. House speakership in Washington. It was a nationwide Republican tide, and Madigan could not withstand that, no matter how good he was at keeping things together. And the maps in Illinois had been drawn by Republicans because the Democrats had lost a vote, but Madigan had maintained his speakership 4 out of the 5 elections during that stretch, even though there were Republican maps. Well, he wins it back. He was only out for 2 years, and even though it was a Republican map, he won it back. He had a 60 to 58 majority in the House, the slimmest there's ever been. But he took it back a few years later. His daughter became state senator. A few years later, she became attorney general. The same year, which was 2002, when she was elected attorney general, a guy named Rod Blagojevich was elected governor. Well, Madigan and Blagojevich battle it out all the time, and just one example of how they couldn't trust each other was when they passed a budget. Madigan required that on like a couple dozen major items, he required that Blagojevich actually agree in a side note to the budget, just like a union contract of some sort where there's a side agreement, that you really will agree to spend the money the way you said you're going to when you signed the budget. So it was unheard of that you have that kind of distrust. But anyway, they did that, and then they battled over all kinds of different things. But then when it came to re-election time in 2006, Madigan was co-chair of Blagojevich's re-election. And so 2007 came and went. There was another big budget battle. And then 2008 came along, and a guy named Barack Obama was elected president. He had been a state senator only a few years before. He was a U.S. senator when he was elected. And a few days after Obama was elected, Blagojevich is arrested by the FBI. And it's for trying to sell the U.S. Senate seat that was vacated by Obama. Back then, the governor could make an appointment to fill a vacancy. So Blagojevich is arrested. While he's arrested and while his charges are pending, he appoints Roland Burris to be the U.S. senator. And Madigan starts rolling impeachment proceedings and did impeach him, and he led the impeachment of that. And then Quinn moves up, Pat Quinn moves up from lieutenant governor to governor. And Quinn came out and said, hey, the finances are a mess, we need an income tax increase. I'm running for re-election, but this is what we got to do. And he actually got elected running, saying he wanted an income tax increase. They did not pass it before the election. They waited until after the election, and then they passed an income tax increase that raised it up to 5%. And it was a lame duck veto session where they pulled that off. They also quickly passed a ban on the death penalty in Illinois. There had been a moratorium on it for years. And they also passed civil unions. And then they quickly after that passed marriage equality. So when that happened, Madigan got up before the House. And you got to remember, Madigan, for all of his Democratic prowess, he was a pretty conservative guy. He came from the Southwest Side conservative area, and they, weren't necessarily big on taxes. They weren't necessarily big on, all kinds of openness. And so he gets up and he quotes the Pope, and the Pope had just said, who am I to judge? And Madigan quotes those words on the House floor, and he not only voted for that, but he rounded up some votes for it. And he also, by quoting the Pope, also gave some political cover to some of the Catholics who were worried about not voting for gay marriage. So then, fast forward along, Lisa Madigan decides she's not going to run for a fifth term as Attorney General. By that time, she served for 16 years as Attorney General, and she said she wasn't going to do it partly because too much power in one family may not be the right thing to do. Now, there were some discussions, of course, between her and the Speaker, and we finally caught up with the Speaker and said, well, were you talking about these things? And she said she didn't want you to be Speaker while she was governor. We didn't want to have these kind of family fights in public, etc. And he said, she knew. She knew that I was going to stay. And so that was that was how he kind of ended the discussion. He was not always a very talkative guy. We move on. Pat Quinn, he got a 4-year extension on the tax increase. He's running again. He says we need to have a permanent income tax increase, and he loses. And he loses to Bruce Rauner, a Republican. And so Madigan and Rauner have these tremendous knockdown dragouts, standoff. A budget did not get signed for 2 years in Illinois. Just an incredible thing. One of the few things you got to do in state government is pass a budget. And so, thank you, Joanna. And so they eventually got to the point where social service safety nets were tearing apart. The universities weren't getting all the money that they needed. The schools weren't getting all the money. The road contractors were not getting billed. They were like $15 billion behind in paying bills. $15 billion is like half the size of an annual budget. So Madigan pulls together a coalition of Democrats and Republicans, and they pass an income tax. And then they, Greg Campos is now here, ladies and gentlemen, retired railroad executive, sir. And so he now pulls this together. They pass an income tax increase. Rauner vetoes it. Madigan holds the coalition together. They override him. They pass a budget, and they put in place, they bring back some stability to the finances. I talked to Madigan during the trial on a break, and I said, now they're talking about they're short of money again. And he goes, yeah, well, they're Democrats, So, anyway, Rauner, while he was running for re-election against J.B. Pritzker, the Democratic governor that we have now, told reporters at one time, I'm not in charge here. I'm trying to be in charge, but I'm not in charge. And nobody really had to ask who was really in charge at that point. So then we move into, that was the year 2018. Now, I want you to remember that a lot of this stuff was happening from 2011 to 2019. And that was the time period that the ComEd scandal was going down. And in the beginning of 2018, there was a turning point for Madigan. And the turning point was that, and I'm saying this because it turned out they were rattled by this, not because I wrote the story, but what happened was a staffer, a campaign staffer, I'd gotten some calls, heard a few tips, eventually negotiated an interview, talked to a woman named Elena Hampton. She was a campaign staffer for Madigan. She had done some work in the state. She was familiar with Madigan, had gone to his headquarters a few times over the years. She was kind of a protege of Marty Quinn, who was the alderman of the 13th Ward. Marty Quinn was Madigan's hand-picked 13th Ward alderman. Madigan, again, committeeman of the 13th Ward, which has more clout than the alderman overall, stunningly. But anyway, Madigan finds out about this, and he announces, I interview Elena at February 11th on a Sunday night, and I've got this, my colleague Stacy Westcott, a great photographer and videographer, she had taped everything. We had this package. I'd looked at all the texts, and Lena said that Kevin Quinn, the brother of Marty Quinn, had harassed her repeatedly. And she showed me the text. She told me about the calls. She told me that this was going on. And so Stacy and I were trudging back out Actually, Elena left with us at the same time on Michigan Avenue, and she turns around. Stacy snaps that incredible shot of her that runs on page 1. But what happened was the very next day, Stacy and I are walking back. It's snowing, it's cold, the wind's blowing on the Michigan Avenue Bridge. It's probably about 9 or 10 o'clock, and we're thinking, man, it's going to take a while to nail this down because we got to get everybody's side and we got to check things out. Fortunately, that night I was able to talk to somebody who could corroborate how she had talked about this at a contemporary time. And so then I finished writing up my notes. It's about 1 o'clock. It's cold. The snow's on the ground, and everything seems to be, at a point where we can't even figure out whether we're going to be able to get this story done. But then a few hours later, Madigan puts out a press release that said, I got rid of Kevin Quinn. I ousted Kevin Quinn. I thought, man, did the guy get ahead of the story? Did he hear that I'd interviewed? And they said no. They were stunned I talked to her. And they said that they didn't know that I talked to her. But then suddenly I got the story. I was thinking, man, it might be months to get this thing done. And all of a sudden we're like trying to figure out how fast to do it. So we get it done. We throw it together. We hold off the main story. We write a brief. We hold off on the main story until the 10 o'clock news had gone by, so that nobody else would have her name and would be able to beat us. We wanted to have this on the front page, and we put out the entire package. We had the scoop. So this turned out to be an issue for Madigan. The very next day, she held a press conference in Chicago. Madigan held one in Springfield. They ended up booting another operative from Madigan's political operation, not because of sexual harassment, but because of abusive nature of the campaign operative. Then Lou Lang actually is accused of sexual harassment. He denied it. It was never proven. An IG Inspector General looked at it and said she couldn't prove it up, and the accuser did not cooperate. But Lou Lang was busted down to a rank and file voluntarily. He said, I want this to be investigated, etc. He had been a deputy majority leader and had hoped at one day to be speaker. Then the session adjourns, and Tim Mapes is accused of sexual harassment. He is the chief of staff for Madigan and had been for decades. He had been chief of staff, he was the House clerk, and he was also the executive director of the Democratic Party of Illinois under Madigan. And Madigan jettisons him, because all this is happening, he's already rattled by this, and Madigan jettisons Mapes within hours. And so we're going into 2018, and we see that J.B. Pritzker beats Rauner, and 2019 starts rolling, and the first indictment to come out of federal court in 2019 is Ed Berg. And then a few weeks later, the Sun-Times pops a story that Danny Solis, the alderman that Madigan had worked with, had been wearing a wire on Berg. So Madigan, he stops talking to Danny Solis. But he doesn't stop talking to Mike McLean. Mike McLean's a buddy of his. He's a contract lobbyist for ComEd. And they are longtime acquaintances. McLean used to be a lawmaker with Madigan back in the 70s. And McLean is wired by the feds, and neither Madigan or McLean know it. McLean's talking to all kinds of people. Back about early January of 2019, the ComEd came knocking on the door of one of their executives and talked him into wearing a wire. And so there are like 3 wires, 2 or 3 wires going here. Madigan and McLean have no idea how all this is happening, that all this is happening rather, and sooner or later, 2019 comes to, the spring session comes to an end, and J.B. Pritzker's getting all kinds of stuff, man. He's got like a $45 billion package, and he's getting expansion of all kinds of different projects, and expanding gambling, etc. In the middle of May, McLean's house and several other people's houses were raided by the FBI. And so one question I still have hanging is how many people actually notified Madigan while this was happening in the legislature that the FBI was out there raiding all of his friends' houses. So anyway, Madigan denies that he's a target. We're meanwhile writing stories. Let's see what else. We're writing stories. This is McLean. He's caught on tape saying we had to hire these guys. Madigan wanted us to hire them. Let's see here. Whoops, getting a little bit ahead of myself here. And so they eventually indict McLean in 2020. First, there was a ComEd had agreed to pay a $200 million fine, a record for this Chicago area. And in their agreement, they agreed that they would cooperate, and they admitted that they had showered Madigan with a variety of jobs for his allies, and that they had also appointed a person on their board because Madigan wanted the guy, and thrown a whole bunch of college internships in for good measure, I guess. And they had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a bribery charge being dropped against them. So it was called a defense. They had that, and the whole issue came out. I was actually in the hospital in Cleveland. I get a call the day before this whole agreement comes down, and I call my folks back in the office and say, hey, this big thing's going down, you better round up the troops. And sure enough, this whole agreement came down, and during the agreement, Madigan was labeled Public Official A. And it was clear in the agreement, they even said with the House Speaker, they didn't name him, but it was clear it was Madigan. So his troops are already kind of weakened in their support for him because of the whole scandal with the Me Too movement that had broken out in Springfield. And so a woman named Stephanie Kefawit, who was a representative from the suburbs, came out and said, I'm going to run against him. Well, that was like, unheard of in Madiganville. So others started saying, and we're going to support him for speaker. And anything Madigan was touching was like a albatross around whatever issue or candidate. So J.B. Pritzker was pushing a proposal, a constitutional amendment that called for the people with the biggest paychecks to pay the biggest income tax, and that failed. Madigan was supportive of it. That failed. Madigan had supported a guy named Thomas Kilbride for the Supreme Court. He had been on the court for 20 years, and Madigan had supported him, pumped millions of dollars into his campaign, was supporting him again. He failed to get a retention vote. You don't even run against somebody. You just run to get 60% of the vote and you're back in for another 10-year term. But he failed to get that. And after that, Dick Durbin, the U.S. Senator, comes up and says, I think Madigan ought to step down from the party chairmanship. Then J.B. Pritzker says, me too. They're looking for somebody to blame here for the failures. And Senator Tammy Duckworth says he ought to not only step down from the chairmanship, he ought to step down as speaker too. Well, so after that, shortly thereafter, the ComEd 4, McLean, the CEO and Pramaggiore of ComEd, John Hooker, a retired executive from ComEd, and Jay Doherty, who was the City Club head here in town and was also a lobbyist, were all indicted. They were, and my brilliant federal courts reporter colleague, Jason Meisner, nicknamed them the ComEd Four, which is stuck to this day. And as you can see here, they brought in some of these people who were paid contracts. They did it in a way that was not direct. They paid Doherty, this lobbyist. ComEd would pay Doherty a check, and Doherty would act like a funnel and send it directly to these folks who were Madigan allies. One of these was Ed Moody, who was a recorder of deeds and a county commissioner and really a legendary precinct captain, one of the best known. He taught other people in Madigan's brigade how to talk people into voting for the Democrats. Anyway, he gets immunity, he talks, and he's given some some of the more incredible statements, like, Madigan said you can have your $45,000 a year contract, but you're still going to do your politics, and if you don't do your politics, you're going to lose that contract because I control the contract. This is Madigan talking about ComEd's money. And then McLean was also talking about, hey, he was caught on tape saying, hey, we had to hire these guys because Madigan said we had to hire them. But they all had been funneled through. Now, just to give you an example of how some of this was going on, after ComEd gets a major package passed in 2011, Madigan's old alderman, Frank Olivo, retires and suddenly ends up getting one of these contracts that he doesn't have to do anything. He's just, the hardest thing he has to do is turn in an invoice every month.